How many shelf queens does it take to screw in a light bulb? I'm not really sure. And this video has nothing to do with queens or light bulbs. But I will show you a model that sat unfinished for nearly 20 years. And we're gonna kick this build up a notch. Hello friends, and welcome back to Small Soldier.
Alright everybody, I'm back!
The first thing I'd like to do is go over some of the things that I completed nearly 20 years ago on this particular model. And I'll also show you what still needs to be completed. Here you can see the difference between the plastic and resin wheels. A huge improvement in my opinion. These are the headlight molds I created from the plastic parts in the kit, and the clear resin copy. Everything I'm showing you now is old work I did from nearly 20 years ago. I really think I just ended up burning myself out on this because it was so much work to bring this model up to the level of detail it deserved. I really enjoy these esoteric subjects. It's really a shame Italeri didn't put more effort into this model. Don't get me wrong, it's okay if you're just looking for a model to represent the vehicle. For me though, since I like details and getting things accurate, it was a bit of a downer. As you can see from the images I've been showing you here, you might understand why I put this model away. I think sometimes we just become overwhelmed with what we're building and we just have to set it aside for a while. And thus, a shelf queen is born. The SPA Verberti AS42 was developed in early 1942. The prototype was presented to the Army on the 9th of July 1942, passed all tests, and was put into production as soon as August 1942. It was designed around the AB41 chassis, but the hull was completely remodeled, taking a shape reminiscent of the German Kübelwagen. The traction was integral, but only the front wheels were steered and the second seat was removed. 20 jerry cans of 20 liter each were carried in 2 rows on the side, along with 4 water jerry cans on the front fenders and the others at the rear supported by the sand ramps. The main fuel tank of 145 liters allowed a range of 300 kilometers, pushed to 1200 kilometers with the addition of the 400 liter jerry cans. The engine was the Fiat SPA 8-cylinder petrol, providing 120 horsepower. The large central open space, also reinforced, allowed the mounting of considerable armament. This could include a Breda AA 20mm autocannon Modello 1935, Breda 13mm machine guns, 20mm Solotherm S18 1000 gun, or 8mm Breda Model 37 machine gun, sometimes in combination. From September to November, the first batch of 140 vehicles was delivered to the Regio Esercito. Besides the driver's seat, the crew that served the onboard weapons were seated on 4 folding seats on the sides. The Sahariana was completely dedicated to desert raiding parties, as it was first intended. Its low profile allowed it to hide behind the dunes and wait for the arrival of enemy unseen, and its great autonomy allowed it to chase enemy forces for long periods. Entering service in December 1942, the AS42 participated in the final stages of the African campaign of Libya and the whole campaign of Tunisia. It was mainly assigned to aviation companies of the Otto-Saharan Company and the 103rd Battalion. Surviving vehicles were later used by the 2nd Battalion of the 10th Regiment in the defense of Sicily and southern Italy. Okay, you've seen what I've done so far on this model. I've given you a brief history, so let's continue. As I stated previously, this model lacks finesse in both the details and fit. First up was to tackle this nasty seam here on the nose of the vehicle. The top had an overhang on it, so I had to use my number 11 blade to scrape away all that excess before I could put any filler in. I then used a sanding stick to blend in the area. Looks pretty good. I shouldn't have to use a whole lot of filler on this part. Normally on a gap like this, I would use CA glue, but since I got most of it sanded pretty smooth, I think I'll just go with the Mr. Surfacer. This next question is a little off topic, but bear with me. I've recently upgraded my audio to a much better microphone. Can you tell the difference in quality? I'd be curious to know. Please let me know in the comments below. Now back to the show.
Booker, will you shut up and let me try and listen to what you're saying?
There's also quite a gap on the bottom of this plate as well, and I unfortunately lose a little bit of detail here. It's just a few rivets, so it's really not a big deal. I'm using a medium grit sanding stick here for the initial sanding process. I really like to make sure that those edges are feathered really nicely back into the plastic. A second and third coat were then added to help blend the edges. And after a light sand, the seam should be virtually invisible. There's a couple ways I like to create weld beads. One is with epoxy putty and the other is styrene rod. Both methods work fine, but sometimes you need to be a little more accurate with the placement of those weld beads, and styrene is the way I like to go when I'm doing that technique. Epoxy putty works best on recessed areas. When creating a weld bead that sits on the surface, it's easier to get a consistent size with styrene rod. When the plastic is soft enough, I use this homemade tool to push in the pattern. And if the plastic starts to dry out, I just add more cement. Here's a close-up of that homemade tool I was talking about. To make one, you just need some copper sheet, form it around a toothpick, and then sharpen or taper the end to about a 45-degree angle. Adding weld beads takes quite a bit of time, but I really think that the effort put in is well worth the results. Time to replace some of those missing rivets. As you can see, these are very small. A varnish such as Future, or any varnish for that matter, really makes a good adhesive for small rivets or even small photo etch pieces. For making domed rivets, this jeweler's beading tool is ideal. Once the crew seats had time to dry, the next step was to add a little bit of texture to them. This helps them look more like realistic fabric. And to soften the texture, add more extra thin cement. And when it's dry, I'll sand that surface to knock back some of that texture. Then a final coat of extra thin to blend everything together. And with a couple coats of Mr. Surfacer, I think you'll agree the results are much better than flat plastic. This is the absolutely horrid resin casting for the side jerry can holders. And this styrene is what I'm going to replace it with. This is what one of the finished pieces looks like. Sometimes scratch building is just a necessary evil. It's not for everybody, but if you've never tried it, I'd suggest giving it a go because it sure is satisfying to see something you've produced from a few reference photos and some styrene. Styrene is surprisingly pliable. I'm using the eye of a needle to roll this piece into shape. Wouldn't it be nice to have extra hands? But since I don't, I made this simple tape jig to help hold the piece down while I glued it in place. And here's a comparison of the scratch built racks compared to the
Crikey dingo.
resin one. Time to mount these beauties.
That's what she said.
The mold quality of the jerry cans was quite nice, but I didn't like the way they spaced them in the molding process, so I decided to saw them apart. By doing this, I was forced to rescribe some detail. I was able to avoid a lot of damage by doing several passes with my X-Acto blade. Once scribed deep enough, it was easy to snap them apart. I then scraped the excess away and sanded it smooth. I then used a pencil to mark out the split on the side of the jerry can. And then the mind-numbing task of scribing out that side detail. I think it looks pretty good, and most of this detail will be hidden once glued together. I think that'll do. I then glued the second platform into position. I didn't have any reference photos for this particular part, but I would assume that there was some kind of supporting structure that helped support these platforms. I'm not sure if this is totally accurate, but it's what I had to go on. Like I said, reference photos were vague, and this is what I came up with. I'm going to create a few weld beads next using a different technique, and I'll be using some pre-rolled green stuff. I prefer this method over styrene rod for smaller areas. The next area that needed some attention was this machine gun mount. This area was quite simplified, and I had to use reference photos to try and make this as accurate as possible. I didn't add every single detail to this, but what I did add helped enhance the look of the mount. I'm using brass rod to create these grab handles, and this small photo etch brake makes an easy task of it. I think that'll do. Here you can see the headlight that's already been hollowed out and the original kit part. These are the molds for the clear headlamps made from the kit parts. I decided to use clear plastic sprue for the headlamps, and you'll see why in a second. These products were what I was going to use to cast these clear parts. But both products were DOA.
You throwing this out?
I believe that's what you do with garbage, you idiot.
The trick here is to heat the plastic without burning it. I then press the melted plastic into the mold. Grinding out plastic with a metal burr can be tricky. The best solution is to go at it slowly and carefully. This would have been much easier using clear resin or a UV resin, But unfortunately, I had to go old school with this one. Still turned out pretty good, I think. One of the last steps is to use a soft rubber burr to smooth out all the damages on the back side of the lens. And the very last step was to give the lens a nice dip in some gloss varnish. Wick off the excess, cover, and let dry. Instead of painting the inside of the headlight housing, I opted for this lead sheet. It's a great way to make the mirrored inside of the headlight housing. When you need a little extra working time, 5-minute epoxy is my go-to adhesive. With the 5-minute epoxy applied, I was able to place the lens, and once dry, I used a Q-tip to polish the inside to a nice shine. And what's a headlight without a bulb? And the final product. Looks pretty good, I think. Now to add the final details before going on to the gun assembly. I was lucky enough to source this Aber barrel set, which I think really enhanced the detail and final look of this gun. Cleanup was your standard scrape, shave, and sand. I'm not really sure why there would be a pin ejection mark on the top side of this piece, but nevertheless, it had to be dealt with. And for hard to get at areas like this, I like to use a fiberglass pen. It takes care of pin ejection marks without creating a lot of damage. And of course, using a very fine steel wool at the end really polishes this up.
Nice.
Obviously, the next step was to clean up all these parts for the gun assembly. Removing parting lines and pin ejection marks just seemed to go hand in hand with building any model kit. And this couldn't be more true with a kit of this vintage. I needed a way to remove this gun for detailing without gluing it to the carriage. So I came up with a simple pin assembly where I'd be able to pull the pin and pop the gun out whenever I needed. This next step was surprisingly difficult. The plastic backrest needed to be removed in order to add the photo etch one. I had to be very gentle holding this so I wouldn't break the frame, yet still had to be aggressive with removing the actual plastic. It was quite difficult and time consuming. When removing photo etch from the frame, it's always best to tape things down so you don't have parts go flinging all over the place. I also like to cut on a hard surface, that way the photo etch doesn't become deformed. Just like with a plastic kit, there will be sprue gates to be removed, and a metal file works great for this. Occasionally you'll need to roll photo etch, like the backrest on this seat. There's many ways of doing it, but this tool works best in my opinion. If you're interested in learning more about photo etch, check the video out in the upper right hand corner, I'm sure it'll help. I try to blacken most photo etch pieces on a model kit. I find it helps reduce the chance of somebody seeing that shiny brass if a piece of paint chips off. These grab handles just didn't look right to me, so I decided to make my own out of some wire. A fairly easy task for some great results. The machine gun barrel on this kit part sucked, so I replaced it with this brass tubing. This photo etch brake, known as the bug, is ideal when working with smaller photo etch pieces. I find this tool very efficient. By turning the knob, you can rotate it 365 degrees to access all 4 sides. Cutting the barrels off the main gun was a little more difficult. I had to be careful not to damage surrounding areas. Here's a few components detailed off screen. Sometimes it's just too hard to film this stuff. When making domed rivets, I prefer metal, and the thickness of a tin can is perfect. These tiny rivets will enhance the detail of the rear view mirrors. Some may think I'm crazy for doing this, but it's the details that really matter in the end. Crazy is as crazy does. I used a micro chisel here to remove this poorly detailed part. I can't remember where I got these sanding sticks, but they work great for hard to get at areas. Like I said earlier, clear coats can be used as an adhesive for small photo etch bits. The advantage here is that you have time to move it around to get it into position before it dries. This rolling tool also has a rubberized back, which really comes in handy when you need to finesse some of the detail. The brass part you see here was the part I was rolling in the last part of the video. It was hard enough just making this piece, let alone filming it. I'm no film guru, but I do the best I can. This was not an easy task, but I'm pretty stoked with the results. I thought the magazine looked a little empty, so I needed some ammunition to fill the rack. Well, maybe this is where I need to invest in that 3D printer. I really think the next build's gonna be out of the box. I do love the details, don't get me wrong, but I'm not sure if I ever want to build an old model like this again. It's just so much work and so draining. I remember now why I put it away. I'm pretty sure we're supposed to enjoy doing this hobby, and if a project is becoming a chore and you're not having fun with it anymore like I was with this one, I really don't think it's that bad of an idea to put it away for a while. You can always come back to it 20 years later.
Crazy. I mean, like so many positive ways.
And these are all the finished components for the gun ready to be assembled. Now that the hard work was done, it was just a matter of putting all the parts together and putting them in their place. This part was really nostalgic for me. It's been a long time since I've melted any plastic. Well, intentionally anyway. This project was a long time in the making, and I have to say that I really enjoyed it this time. So I'd say if you have a project that's been sitting on the shelf for a while collecting dust, well, maybe take it out and give it another go. And you just may surprise yourself how much you enjoy building it again. Folks, if you made it this far, I really appreciate you sticking around to the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a blast making it. And I hope to have another video for you guys, well, sooner than later. If you enjoy what I'm doing here, please consider subscribing, hit the bell notification so you never miss another episode, and probably the most important thing you can do is leave me a like. This tells YouTube that you're enjoying my content and they'll share it with others just like you. I'll now leave you with the completed build. Painting and a small vignette will be up next. As always, take care of yourself and keep building those models.